Freedom's boundaries at home and abroad, 1890 to 1900. The 1890s, the last decade of the century, witnessed multiple conflicts over the American freedom, as if we hadn't had enough in the prior 20 years. But many workers and their allies came to believe that employers were denying them economic independence and democratic self-government. Millions of farmers joined something called the populist movement to try to reverse their economic decline and take back the government from what they viewed as a powerful corporate interest. A new racial system in the South confined African Americans to second-class citizenship status, denying them freedoms assumed by many Americans, which we learned about with the Black Codes. Increasing immigration, from Europe predominantly, sparked debates about whether the nation should continue to offer freedom to foreigners. Sound like something we're debating right now about our little country to the south. And by the end of the decade, the nation, due to the Spanish-American War, began to rule overseas possessions in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And many debated whether these new peoples would be subject or are they going to be citizens, and whether the United States was still a republic or had we become an empire like the countries in Europe. Like workers, farmers in the South and West face growing economic insecurity as agricultural prices fall and economic dependency on the merchants and banks seem to increase. Sharecropping kept millions of blacks and white Southern farmers in poverty, and an oversupply of world cotton led to a dramatic price decrease that seemed to threaten the Southern farmers' livelihood and prosperity. Now, these farmers soon blamed their woes on the railroads' high freight rates or high interest rate loans from their banks and the merchants, and of course the fiscal policies of the federal government that reduced the money supply and decreased farm prices. Farmers organized something called the Farmers Alliance in Texas in the late 1870s, and it quickly spread to dozens of other states. Now, in the beginning, the alliance at first stayed away from politics, and it was more like a FHA or FFA meeting in the countryside where they'd get together and they would complain and they'd have a rodeo and a picnic, but they didn't really want to get into politics. And they established cooperatives called exchanges, and they were going to finance and market crops. But the banks refused to loan money to these exchanges. So the alliance proposed that something called a sub-treasury plan, whereby the federal government would establish warehouses where farmers could store their crops until they were sold, and by using the crops as collateral, the government could issue loans directly to farmers at low interest rates, thus ending their dependence on banks and merchants for credit. The demands for the sub-treasury led to the alliance going into politics. In the early 1890s, the alliance formed a People's Party called the Populist, which was the area's greatest political legacy. The Populists appealed not just to farmers, but to all producers, which included miners, industrial workers, and small businessmen. But most of its supporters were cotton and wheat farmers in the South and the West. The Populists organized massive educational campaigns using pamphlets, newspapers, and revival-style mass meetings throughout the country. This was the last expression of the 19th century idea that America was a commonwealth of small producers whose freedom rested on individual ownership of productive property and the dignity of labor. But the Populists were forward-looking. They embraced scientific methods of agriculture and modern technologies, and made large-scale cooperatives possible, such as the railroad and the telegraph and national market. And they really wanted the federal government to regulate those organizations for the public interest, a very 20th century idea. The Populists adopted a platform in a meeting in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892, where he proposed many measures to restore democracy and economic opportunity for the ordinary American, and some of which would come to pass in the next century, such as a direct election of U.S. senators, government control of currency, a graduated income tax, low-cost public financing for farmers, and workers' rights to organize. The platform also called for national ownership of the railroads to allow the farmers to inexpensively get their crops to market. But in some parts of the South, the Populists heroically tried to unite black and white farmers on a common political and economic program, but let's face fact, that's not going to happen. Because racism was a legacy of the Civil War, and the fact that many white populists were landowning farmers while black farmers were tenants and agricultural workers, they faced a very difficult set of problems, and it kind of mitigated any such alliance. But the black farmers organized their own Cotton Farmers Alliance, whose strikes were suppressed by white authorities, and some of whom were even sympathetic to white populists. Well, while the white populists were really not anti-racist, some recognized that whites would have to appeal to blacks in order to break the Democratic Party's hold in the South and any opposition they had to any kind of reform. And in places like North Carolina, where white and black populists together won state elections, which was a rarity. Because in most states, Democrats defeated the populists by mobilizing whites to vote against the Negro supremacy. They intimidated blacks, they rigged elections. And the populists also engaged the reform efforts of farmers and middle-class women, and they began to endorse women's suffrage in many states. In 1892, the populist candidate for president, James Weaver, won more than 1 million votes, and the party carried over 5 western states and elected 3 governors and 15 members of Congress. So for a new party, they're growing. The Republican cartoon, vote for the silver. We'll get into the silver and gold issue very shortly. And this shows the populist strength. As you can see, it's predominantly in the Midwest, although Alabama is in there a little bit. But Wyoming, South Carolina, Nebraska, and Alabama, they're populist, but not 100%. But look at all the white. Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Virginia, all those northeastern states too. They were very definitely against the populists. This shows the presidential election of 1892, and as you can see, solid green, Democratic. The blue is the populist. It's not as popular right now, but there's still a lot of voting going on. A severe depression hit in 1893, and it kind of intensified the conflict between labor and capital. And it seemed that the populists might gain the votes of industrial workers who had traditionally supported one of the 2 major parties. But employers using state or federal authority to protect their economic power and suppress labor unrest. In May of 1894, the federal government dispersed something called Coxey's Army. It was a march of unemployed, led by an Ohio businessman, Jacob Coxey, that converged to the nation's capital, demanding that the government do something to create jobs. Also in 1894, workers in Pullman, Illinois, who manufactured the railroad cars for the Pullman Company, went on strike against pay cuts. And for you young who do not know what a Pullman car is on a train, believe me, it's like a yacht on rails. It is the deluxe way of traveling on a train. When the 150,000 members of the American Railroad Union, a union of skilled and unskilled workers led by the charismatic Eugene V. Debs, refused to work on Pullman cars, they paralyzed the nation's rail traffic. And President Grover Cleveland, he won an injunction from the federal courts that ordered the strikers back to work. Violence between strikers and troops from Maine to California left 34 dead, and when the union leaders, including Debs, were imprisoned for violating the injunction, the strike did collapse. The Supreme Court reaffirmed Debs' sentence in a famous ruling approving the use of injunctions against strikers, especially when it involves the public safety. After all, the trains were carrying the U.S. mail, federal mail, And Debs claimed that the powerful capitalists had aligned with the state and national governments and now were infringing on America's freedom. In 1894, the populists doubled their efforts to appeal to the industrial workers, and in state and congressional elections that year, with the Depression worsening, voters abandoned the Democrats. The populist vote in rural areas increased, but most workers did not vote populist. Few populist demands spoke to the workers' needs and their calls for higher agricultural prices. The city worker thought it would raise their food costs and diminish the value of their wages, so they were not for it. And the Protestant revivalist culture alienated the Catholics and immigrant workers, so we're gaining some support in some areas and losing in others. So the urban workers abandoned the Democrats and went for the Republicans, who argued that higher tariff rates would revive the economy because it's going to protect the American manufacturing system and the workers from imports and this cheap foreign labor. And the Republicans managed to gain a massive 177 seats in the House. In 1896, the Democrats and populists united behind presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, a young congressman from Nebraska. Oh, my tongue is really confused. I'm sorry. Bryant had the reputation for being the type of person who could charm a bird out of a tree. I have not had the good fortune to hear some of his recordings because we do have some recording, but of course those 150 years old, they're kind of squeaky. He was a tall, good-looking man. He appealed to the farmers considerably, and he won the Democratic nomination in a speech that captured the fears and hopes of farmers. Bryan called for free coinage of silver, which is the gold and silver standard. Farmers thought that if the government was forced to buy all silver that it was mined, this would increase the circulation of money in the economy and thus help the farmers. That's always been the call from the public. If we are having problems, that the government should increase their supply of money, print more money. It don't work that way. And he used biblical imagery to condemn the gold standard because everybody else wanted to use gold and just buy certain amounts of silver. And the most famous lines of political oratory in American history were uttered. He's standing up there in front of this large audience, and he said, "You shall not press down upon this brow of labor, this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And he threw back his arms like a man on the crucifix, being crucified. And his demand for free silver was the latest expression of a long-standing view that increasing the amount of currency in circulation would raise the prices for farmers and make it easier for them to pay their debts. So Bryan's nomination represented a shift in the Democratic leadership away from the elites, like Cleveland, who had been tied to the Eastern businessmen. But Bryan's appeal was highly religious and revivalistic, and very influenced by the social gospel in the South especially. Republicans had argued that gold was the only honest currency and that abandoning it would prevent economic recovery by scaring creditors away from making loans. And they nominated Ohio Governor William McKinley, who passed the highly protective McKinley Tariff Act in Congress in 1890. In 1896, the election was the first modern presidential election. The Republicans poured an unprecedented amount of money into a highly organized campaign that used a massive educational effort directed against the Democrats and their calls for free silver. The results showed a very definite divide along regional lines of those who were for the free silver or the unlimited coinage of silver and those who were for the gold standard. McKinley won the election with the votes of all the industrial states because although there were fewer, the population was greater. He got the Northeast and part of the Midwest. Labor conflict did not produce political results. Party politics seemed to kind of tap down or mute the class conflicts and not reinforce it. Because industrial America, from the workers and the industries, voted solidly Republican, and they continued to do so for years. So McKinley's victory shattered the political stalemate of the previous 20 years and launched a period of Republican dominance that's going to last until the 1930s, with a very short period of Democratic rule and just as the 20th century starting. It marked a height in voter participation which has not been seen since. The populist defeat in the South allowed for the imposition of a new racial order. The Redeemers, remember from last time, a coalition of merchants, planters, and businessmen who had ruled in the region after 1877 and claimed to have redeemed the South from the corruption and horrors of black rule, wanted to reverse the Reconstruction achievements. They reduced taxes and public spending. They cut back public schools and especially hurt the blacks. New laws allowed the arrest of those without employment and increased punishment for petty crimes such as the Black Codes. And the South's prison population rose. Convicts, mostly poor blacks, they would be rented out to railroads and miners and lumber companies as cheap involuntary labor at a very high profit for those renting them out. And labor unions in the South assaulted the convict labor system because you're taking jobs away from white folks who need them. In the 1880s, Atlantic editor Henry Rady relentlessly promoted the dream of a new South, in which industrialization and agricultural diversification would deliver prosperity to the region. Of course, it's a dream. It's a pipe dream. Because while planters, merchants, and industrialists prospered, the region as a whole became more impoverished. You have uneducated workers, and you have people from the North not wanting to invest in the South. And mining and textiles did develop in some areas, but like I say, the low wages and the high taxes and the convict labor did not really spur any economic development. And by 1900, except for the major iron and industrial city of Birmingham, southern cities had very little industry and mostly exported cotton, tobacco, and rice. So the South as a whole stayed dependent on the North for capital and manufactured goods. Now, black farmers, the most disadvantaged rural Southerners, suffered the most from the region's economic conditions. Of course, in the upper South, mines, iron mills, and tobacco farmers offered some jobs to black workers, and while some black farmers did own their land, but they're few. In the rice kingdom of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the plantations went to ruin, and many blacks acquired land and became self-sufficient farmers. But in most of the deep South, blacks owned a smaller percentage of land in 1900 than they had in the late 1870s, right after the war. In southern cities, institutions such as schools, churches, businesses, and the clubs created by the blacks during the Reconstruction formed the basis of dynamic black growing middle class culture. But the labor market was racially divided, and black men were excluded from professional and skilled jobs, while black women were limited to wage work as domestic servants and were excluded from any occupation open to a white woman. And most unions in the South excluded blacks from any membership at all. So blacks trapped at the bottom in the economically stagnant South began to immigrate by the tens of thousands. In 1879 and 1800, nearly 60,000 African Americans moved to Kansas, seeking political rights and safety and education and economic opportunity. Its participants called this move the Exodus, of course named after the biblical account of the Jews' flight from slavery in Egypt. But despite worsening conditions, most blacks had no choice but to stay in the South. Because while economic expansion took place in northern cities, most employers there offered jobs only to white migrants from rural areas in Europe, not the blacks. Only in World War I did jobs open up for blacks, which helped spur a massive movement north called the Great Migration. Here you see a group of Kansas populists leaving, going to head out to the west where it's supposed to be better. It's going to turn out not to work that way, but at this time they thought anything was better than what they had. Over Kansas, 1878. We still are full of hope. Decline of black politics. But despite redemption, the blacks continued to hold office and vote in the South after 1877, although it's getting fewer. And even while Democrats reconstructed Southern politics to limit black political power and representation, blacks continue to hold office in states and Congress. But black political opportunities began to diminish. Talented and ambitious black men increasingly avoided politics and entered business, law, or the church. Black women became political leaders, and respectable middle-class black women began to press for women's rights and racial progress. They organized something called the National Association of Colored Women, formed in 1896, way before the NAACP was formed. In some states, blacks continued to vote, and Republicans stayed competitive with Democrats. But by the 1890s, populists and Republicans led state governments such as North Carolina, and they began to see other states fall to racial violence and electoral fraud. Between 1890 and 1906, every southern state enacted laws or constitutional provisions intended to eliminate the black vote. Because the 15th Amendment prohibited the use of race as a qualification for suffrage, Southern lawmakers, well, they're very creative. They began to design laws that seemed colorblind, but they were really meant to keep the blacks from voting. The most popular, of course, was the poll tax, a fee you had to pay to be eligible to vote. There was a literacy test where you were forced to read, and as I said earlier, if you were white, you were told to read the Lord's Prayer. If you were black, you were told to read the state constitution and interpret it to the white man's satisfaction. Although some white leaders presented disenfranchisement as a good government measure that would end fraud and violence in elections, it was a means of ending black participation in politics, and it worked. And by 1940, only 3% of the adult blacks in the South were registered to vote. 3%, folks. Unfortunately, poor and illiterate whites were also disenfranchised by these laws. And it led to the generalization of Southern demagogues, or politicians who mobilized white voters by appealing to their racism. And disenfranchisement could not have occurred without Northern approval. Let's be honest about it. In 1891, the state defeated a protest to protect black voting rights in the South, and the Supreme Court approved disenfranchisement laws. And according to the 14th Amendment, any state that deprived its citizens, male citizens, of the franchise, it was supposed to lose part of their representation in Congress. But this did not apply to blacks. Thus, Southern congressmen had a far greater power than their small electorates actually warranted. Alongside disenfranchisement in the 1890s, segregation was imposed throughout the South. Laws and local customs that required separating the races had existed in the North before the Civil War and during Reconstruction. Southern schools and other institutions had been segregated. But when you get right down to it, after the Civil War, there was no segregation. The blacks and whites more or less lived together. Yes, they had separate jobs, but they would walk down the street together. They would, it was just kind of an intermingled society. But now, all of a sudden, after the war, because the white man is so afraid of the black men gaining anything, we're going to segregate them. Some railroads, theaters, and hotels did admit blacks and whites, and others discriminated. But in 1883, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed racial discrimination from hotels and public facilities, and held that the 14th Amendment banned unequal treatment by state authorities, not private businesses. So in a landmark decision of 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, the court approved state laws requiring separate facilities for black and white, arguing that segregated facilities did not discriminate as long as they were separate but equal. And it all started in a case when a black man was sitting in the car he'd been sitting in for years. It had whites in Louisiana. Separate but equal. States began to respond to this by passing laws requiring segregation in every part of Southern life, in schools, in hospitals, in toilets, in cemeteries. And despite the doctrine of separate but equal, facilities for blacks were either inferior or even non-existent. Segregation was an important part of a system of white supremacy in the South, in which each part, such as disenfranchisement, economic inequality, inferior education, reinforced the others. Segregation did not so much keep races apart as ensure that whites would have the advantage wherever they did meet. A racial social etiquette, as they say, developed in which the blacks had to give way to whites on sidewalks and could not even raise their voices at whites or otherwise be assertive. You cannot defend yourself. Blacks who challenged white supremacy or refused to accept the indignities of segregation faced political and legal power and immediate violent reprisal. In each year between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 persons, 99% of them black, were lynched in the South. Those are the ones we know about. And lynching is going to continue well into the 20th century. As I said, some were secret, others were public, and promoted by organizations and the media. And although we're not going to go into, your text does mention a few of the violent things, such as burning alive and dragging and the horrible things that white men would do. And they usually resulted after a false accusation. Yes, there were laws against it, but that didn't prevent lynching, nor did it punish the lynchers. Most of the victims had been accused of raping or assaulting a white woman, or allegations which were usually without basis, because anytime there was hanky-panky between a white and black, as soon as it was found out, the white woman always screamed rape. But many white Southerners considered preserving white womanhood as a sufficient basis for murder. Lynching is virtually unknown as a phenomenon anywhere else in the world. The reconciliation of the North and South in the 1880s and 1890s came at the cost of widespread hopes for racial equality that existed during and after the Civil War. In popular literature and in veterans' reunions, the war came to be remembered as a tragic struggle between brothers, in which blacks had played no role, and which had been caused by a clash over states' rights and the preservation of the Union, not slavery. Reconstruction came to be universally seen as a period of black misrule imposed on the South by the North, a view which legitimized disenfranchisement and segregation in the South. Southern governments and schools celebrated the lost cause of the Confederacy and condemned the evils of Reconstruction. These lynchings are the ones that we know about, as I said, and they were going to continue well beyond 1918. Paula Giddings, professor of Afro-American Studies at Smith College, is a narrator of this book review too. I think you're going to be surprised.
The legal definition of lynching is when 3 or more persons, which constitute a mob, put someone to death extra-legally without court sanction, without legal sanction, and they do it for the purpose of tradition and or whatever their version of justice is. And this becomes a legal definition by the 1920s of the NAACP and their struggle, of course, against lynching and trying to make lynching a federal crime. Lynching actually begins in the Revolutionary War years. And it's named after the brother of the man who founded Lynchburg, Virginia. And lynching took place, this is extra-legal justice, in quotes, takes place during that period of time because it's not too many courts. It's sort of difficult to get to them. This is a period, the British are also in place in many places in the South, and so it becomes very dangerous to move around. And so this is a form of justice, of local justice that is not condoned by a formal court. It's interesting, it's not until 1886 that the number of black lynch victims actually exceed the number of white lynch victims. So this is an American tradition that becomes racialized later for a number of reasons. There's a constant struggle over the meaning of who deserves the protection and rights that are talked about in the U.S. Constitution. And what happens, of course, is that one of the function of a stereotype, of a racial stereotype, is to show that someone is undeserving of first-class citizenship. And until rather recently, first-class citizenship was seen not as a right, but as a privilege. And it was a privilege accorded to those with a particular character and who lived their life in a particular way and had the honor that you are talking about. This really stymied activism because in the history, African-American history, there is which still exists to some extent, a big conservative element that really says, you know, if we live our life a certain way, we're going to become first-class citizens. That's what the Constitution says, but it's a privilege, it's not a right.
In the late 19th century, an evolving scientific theory claimed that human beings could be categorized and ranked by such constructs as social standing and group affiliation.
Drawing on Charles Darwin's theory of biology that the fittest will survive, this science, called social Darwinism, perpetuated various myths about how societies evolved.
One particularly destructive myth was that black people were inferior to white people.
And therefore, there was a justification to suppress their advancement in all areas, lest the society as a whole be brought down.
There had been prejudices always around color, ever since, you know, the first Africans came to the U.S., but they changed. And in the late 19th century, with the advent of social Darwinism and the need to think about black people and black labor and black bodies in a particular way, we begin to see this idea that blacks are actually beginning to devolve down the evolutionary scale, devolve into more primitive identities, and with primitive, of course, is lasciviousness and lack of control, lack of character, lack of honor, etc. And scientists actually sought to prove these things empirically. And from there, they begin to also think about the notion of what is happening to women. The idea around women's sexuality begins to change in this period of time as well. This need for this passionless sort of idea of white women who need to maintain their purity and the purity of the race, which is one of the fears, the bugaboos that come up around interracial relationships and this charge of rape.
While there was no shortage of reasons for discrimination against black people by white in this period, the emerging myth of the threat of the rape of a white woman by a black man became a tense focal point, and the often false accusation of rape, the chief justification for lynching.
One person of the period to expose this destructive myth was black journalist and anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells.
Ida Wells was an activist, a woman who was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. And in 1892, a very good friend of hers was actually lynched in Memphis, Tennessee, by the name of Tom Moss and two other men along with him. And what she begins to understand is that lynching is really taking on a new kind of face, quite literally. That blacks are being victimized now in greater numbers. And the reason that is given for this rise in lynchings, which reaches a peak in 1892, is the accusation that black men are raping white women. And she says it's new because there's no history of this in the numbers that people are professing. She knows that Thomas Moss certainly hasn't, and there's a whole history, there's a reason why he was lynched. He was actually competing successfully with another, with the white store owner. So what she does, which is really makes her so interesting, I think, an activist, is she becomes an investigative reporter. And so when she starts talking against lynching, she's just not giving an opinion, she's actually going to the sites of lynchings. She's using statistics that other people also use to disprove the idea by simply finding out instances when there was a charge of rape that often they were just consensual relationships between black men and white women. And that in and of itself it turns the world upside down. Because if it's consensual, black men aren't monsters, as even now the social scientists are saying. If it's consensual, white women aren't desexualized and innocent of any kind of behavior or in need of all this protection, which black people are being killed in the name of. So it's a notion that really involves all of them, and they're all often dependent on the other and defined in opposition to the other. You can't have white people if you don't have black people, right? With all of the characteristics that are also defined in opposition to one another. I mean, this is one reason why you have to have lynching, that even segregation, there's too much equality. I mean, you have to have something that really distinguishes white people from black people. And having black people be lynch victims and white people are able to be the spectators, now that's different. Now that is a difference that is consistent.
According to the Tuskegee
Institute,
from 1882 to 1951,
4,730 people,
mostly black,
were lynched in the United States.
They were tortured,
Hanged,
burned alive,
dragged behind trucks,
and in several cases their
their
bodies
bodies
were
were
dismembered.
dismembered, and the pieces either discarded or kept by many as souvenirs.
I hope you found that not only disturbing, but disgusting. Unfortunately, it did happen. And I hope to God that none of you ever see it again. The effective nullification of the Reconstruction-era laws and the amendments in the making of blacks into second-class citizens, they reflected the trends across our nation. America seemed to be factoring along racial and class lines by the late 19th century. And one observer noted that the result was a far-reaching obsession with redrawing the boundary of freedom by identifying and excluding those unworthy of freedom's blessings. And many Americans seem to adopt a rather more exclusive definition of nationhood and national identity. And immigrants were seen as an increasing threat to America's sense of identity and traditions, failing to realize that at one time we were all immigrants. And it was largely due to a change in the sources of immigration to the United States. Because despite the prolonged depression, 3.5 million immigrants came to the United States in the 1890s, looking for work in the Northeast and Midwest. Of course, they didn't want to go south. They came from Ireland, England, Germany, or Scandinavia, which is not where the earlier immigrants had come from. This is where the earlier immigrants had come from. Ireland, England, maybe we say that. In the beginning, they came from Ireland, England, Germany, or Scandinavia. These are the ones who originally settled our country. But these new immigrants, they're coming from a different area. They're coming from Eastern Europe, like Italy and Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian empires. And we're calling them the new immigrants. And we saw them as distinctly different and on a lower level of civilization and education. And they were expected to accept low-paying jobs because they were less of a person and criminally minded. I see these people that came in earlier, the original, the old immigrants, which came in from England and Ireland and Germany and Scandinavia. You see what they have in common as opposed to those that came in, the new immigrants, as things the old. The new immigrants were easily assimilated into our society. They created the society, basically. They were, for the most part, Protestant, had white skins, or fair skins, whereas these coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe, they were usually a little bit darker complected. They had darker hair. They were Catholic or Jewish. They were not our kind of people. The immigration restrictions, the League, which was formed in Boston in 1894, called for reducing immigration by barring the illiterate from entering the country. Well, of course, when you come to this country, if you don't speak the language or read our language, you're going to be considered illiterate. And it was adopted by Congress in 1897, but vetoed by President Cleveland. Although most states adopted what they called a secret ballot as a means of disenfranchising the immigrants, like I said, who could not read English, and they had to have their votes and ballots cast by party workers who put them where they wanted. And states stopped allowing immigrants to vote altogether until they became citizens, and they imposed new residency and literacy requirements on that. So along with the black disenfranchisement in the South, the new immigrants coming in were disenfranchised, and voting seemed to become more of a privilege, not a right. A cartoon from the magazines, you can see people coming into our shores trying to sneak in. And although single Chinese men had been welcomed as cheap contract labor in the West, when the families started to migrate in the 1870s, Congress barred women from migrating. In 1883, Congress temporarily excluded all Chinese immigrants from entering the country legally. And this was the first time that race had been used to exclude an entire group of people from entering our country. And it was made permanent in 1902. When exclusion occurred, more than 100,000 people of Chinese descent already lived in this country, mostly on the West Coast around California. And they began to suffer intense discrimination and occasional mob violence, much as the white black man was in the South. And states like California discriminated against the Chinese in education and any other area they could think of. And while the Supreme Court upheld the right of Chinese to pursue a living and citizenship, especially of the Chinese born in this country, the court also affirmed the right of Congress to enact racial discriminations and restrictions on immigration. You see here we've had the Chinese man in laundry, and he gets destroyed. Booker T. Washington. He's not as sourpuss as he looks in this picture. Social movements had helped to expand the 19th century boundaries of freedom and now revised their goals so they could begin to achieve in new economic and intellectual environments. Some black leaders, for example, started to emphasize self-help and individual self-advancement to enter into the middle-class America as an alternative to getting into politics. And Booker T. Washington symbolized this change. In 1895, Washington delivered a speech at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition, get this, encouraging blacks to, I'm going to say it very slowly, to accommodate segregation and cease agitation for civil and political rights. That bears repeating. Accommodate segregation and cease agitation for civil and political rights. Of course, some of the more educated African American social workers were screaming at the top of their lungs. But then again, playing devil's advocate for just a moment, Booker T, from the South, he had his finger on the pulse of the racism that was rampant in the South. And he knew that you could take a horse to water, but you can't force him to drink. And the South was not ready to accept the black man coming into this society. And if he kept agitating, the white man's going to become more and more adamant about not allowing it. So Booker T's idea was, let's do it gradually. Let's just basically prove to them that we're nothing to be afraid of, that we're good workers and can be trusted. He also founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which became a center for vocational training, which would educate the black man and women for jobs, not liberal arts. He believed obtaining farms and skilled work was more important than full citizenship. Be able to educate yourself and support your family before you start pushing for other things. And he told a white audience in Atlanta, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers on your hand, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Whites who wanted a domicile labor force that would not form unions and work cheaply, they loved this. And while many blacks supported him from a belief that direct assaults on the white power were failures, and that blacks should build up their own communities, they liked this. But take it slow. It will come. It's hard to say whether I'm for him or against him. He had some good ideas. He knew what it was like down there, yet you can only pacify people so long. The dissolution of something called the Knights of Labor and the rise of the American Federation of Labor, which we knew because of that, riot and killing in Chicago in the 1890s, signaled in the labor movement a similar move away from broad reforms to more limited aims. Strikes like the Big Pullman strike, it seemed to show that direct confrontation with capital, it devastated the workers' unions. So the unions declared Samuel Gompers, the AFL-L's founder and lifelong president, they thought he should seek economic independence. Politics or the utopian goals of groups like the Knights of Columbus, and don't go there. Gompers and the AFL, through the unions, would simply bargain with employers, and they'd talk to them. They'd sit down and say, well, we'll give this if you give that. There would be a little compromise. He would work for higher wages and a little bit better working conditions. And like Washington, Gompers used the language of the era's business culture. His strategy was known as business unionism, and he embraced the idea of freedom of contract and turned it into an argument against the interference of judges with workers' right to organize unions. In the 1890s, the union membership recovered from its decline in the late 1880s, but the AFL union that grew abandoned the Knights' idea of solid labor solidarity and restricted its membership to skilled workers. It was a small minority of workers which effectively excluded most unskilled workers who were predominantly black and women, and of course the new Southern European immigrants. The FFL became very strong in trades with highly skilled workers, like in printing and construction, but very weak or non-existent in basic industries like steel or the factories that dominated the economy. Here you've got the mill girls. They're inexperienced. Most of them are foreign, working in the sweatshops or standing in the mill, like working on the line. The changes in the women's movement reflected the same expansion of activity, the narrowing boundaries. In the 1890s, they began what we call the woman's era. 3 decades in which women, though still denied the vote, had greater opportunities for economic independence and a small role in public life. Nearly 5 million women worked for wages by 1900. And though they were young and unmarried and worked in traditional women's jobs such as domestic service and garments, a new generation of college-educated women were beginning to take better paid white-collar jobs. Women also began to have more influence in politics and society through a number of new organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, which moved from demanding prohibition laws to demanding comprehensive economic and political reforms, including the right to vote. Yet feminism in this period moved away from demanding equal rights to claims more in line with a dominant racial and ethnic norm. The women's sphere began to really come forward. With equal rights feminism was never repudiated, the mostly native-born white and middle-class women who were dominating the suffrage movement, they began to lay claims as members of a superior race. And they complained that unworthy non-whites, such as immigrants, had the vote while white women did not. Ooh. They joined for the 1896 meeting of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Give us their rights. We'll get more into the women's movement a little bit later. But America's narrow definition of nationalhood was projected abroad in the late 1890s as the United States becomes an imperial power in the world. And the last quarter of the 19th century is known as the Age of Imperialism. During this time, the rival European empires divided large parts of the world among themselves. In this period, the United States was considered a second-rate power and not included in an imperial competition and diplomacy. Although large land-based empires such as the Russian, the Ottoman, and the Chinese, and overseas empires such as the British, French, and the Spanish dominated much of the 19th century, after 1870, a new imperialism begins to emerge, dominated by the European powers and Japan. Belgium, Great Britain, and France consolidated their colonies in Africa, and Germany acquired colonies on that continent also. The British and Russians intensified their struggle to control Central Asia, and all European powers competed to control parts of China. China was the place to go. And by the early 20th century, most of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Pacific had been divided among these empires, each of them justifying its domination of another people in the name of bringing civilization to backward peoples who required instructions in Western values and governments and Christianity and labor practices. Territorial expansion had been part of American life in the beginning, but in the 1890s marked a major transformation of Americans' relationship to the rest of the world. Just take a minute, and imperialism and expansionism mean somewhat the same, but imperialism means taking over land already occupied by people by force, economic policies, or politics, with no plans of ever becoming part of your country. Whereas expansionism is taking over adjoining land with the plan of making it part of your country, such as moving across the Mississippi and taking over the western lands. That's expansionism. But once we move across into a land that's already occupied by somebody else, that is imperialism. Americans more and more saw their nation as an emerging world power. But until the 1890s, the expansion of the United States had been strictly in North America. And although the Monroe Doctrine shows that many Americans had seen the Western Hemisphere as strictly an American sphere of influence, we began talking about taking Cuba and maybe the Dominican Republic and other territories, but only territory acquired after the Civil War was really the territory of Alaska, and it was regarded by many as worthless. The way we got Alaska was during the Civil War, Russia sent 2 fleets of battleships, one to New York Harbor and one to San Francisco, and they docked with their guns pointed outward. as a show of support for the Union. They never fired a shot. They never offered a man. They never fought a battle. But this was their way of showing support for the Union. And to repay them for their support after the war, well, that's not the whole reason. Part of the reason was Russians were in Alaska, and they're starting to come down the coast of Canada into our northwest, such as, Oregon and Washington. And so it was a way of saying thank you for your support during the Civil War and keep out of our country. Most people thought it was worthless, cold icebox. But most who looked overseas wanted to expand trade, not necessarily to take possessions. Many farmers and manufacturers believed that Americans' production could no longer be absorbed by our domestic markets. And through overproduction, it's causing recurrent economic crises. We want foreign customers for our products. We reached the end of our expansion. We've got to go somewhere else. Now, Christian missionaries had already been active, and they'd been spreading American influence overseas by the late 19th century. And groups like the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions believed it was their mission to prepare the world for Christ's second coming and to enlighten these heathens abroad. A few late 19th century thinkers actively promoted American expansionism. Josiah Strong, a well-known Congregationalist clergyman, tried to update Manifest Destiny in his book Our Country, written in 1885. And here he argued that Anglo-Saxon Americans, who had shown their ability for liberty and self-government in North America, should spread their institutions and values to the inferior races overseas, whom he suggested would benefit not only by our contact, but it would also benefit American manufacturers because they're going to become new customers, new consumers of our goods. Naval officer Alfred T. Mahan, in his Influence of Sea Power Union History, he wrote in 1890, argued that no nation could prosper without a large merchant fleet engaged in international trade. And if you've got that, you've got to have a powerful navy to protect it. And if you've got this powerful navy, you've got to have overseas bases. You've got to have refueling bases, and you've got to have places to do repairs. And Mahan insisted that the western frontier was closed. We had to look overseas for opportunity. He influenced people like James G. Blaine, President Harrison's Secretary of State, who advocated the acquisition of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba for naval bases. And in 1893, the American planters in Hawaii organized a rebellion where they overthrew the native Hawaiian government of Queen Lililoha. Oh, that had to do with a decrease in price. And the white plantation owners in Hawaii were numerically inferior to the native Hawaiians, but they're white and they're educated and they own the plantations. And when the new queen came in, she was tired of having the white people tell her what to do, so she wanted to get all the white people off her island. I mean, she was a queen. It was her land. She wanted the white people gone. But the white people didn't take that too well, and so they organized a rebellion. Of course, there was more native workers than there were white men, but it didn't take long for the white people to call in the American Navy, and there was no real fight. So we effectively took over Hawaii. President Harrison asked the Senate to pass a treaty of annexation, which the next president coming in, Cleveland, withdrew, and in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States annexed the Hawaiian Islands. So the depression that had begun in 1893 intensified and caused Americans to believe that an aggressive foreign policy would create markets for our manufactured goods and help end our depression. Now, all these factors contributing to the emergence of us as a world power in something called the Spanish-American War in 1898. But the war's immediate cause was Cuba. Cuba had long struggled for independence from her native mother country, Spain. 10 years of guerrilla warfare, which had begun in 1868, and a revolt resumed in 1895, and we began to get reports of Cuban civilians suffering in Spanish detention camps. And man, it aroused our outrage and our sympathy for those poor people. Pen and ink drawings are showing up. Strip searching women. And we've got a newspaper war going on. It's just, you're outdoing each other for competition in New York, Pulitzer and Hearst. And if they didn't find any real news to write about, they would make it up. And our policy at the time was one of what they called jingoism. Now, jingoism is a rather unusual word. It just strictly means militaristic foreign policy. In other words, we're going to come to see you and be diplomatic, but we're going to bring a warship and carry a club. And like I say, Hertz and Pulitzer were in a newspaper battle trying to drum up circulation, so they would print regardless. So we begin to... McKinley knew about war. He'd been involved in the Civil War, and he wanted no part of war. And he was afraid if we started getting too nasty, there would be a war. But because the newspapers pushing, the public began to believe what they were reading, and they're pushing the president to find what's really going on. Is this really going on down there? If it is, we got to do something. The cries for intervention increased after February. There was an explosion. We sent down a ship called the Maine to find out what the heck's going on, and there was an explosion, which we found out since then was accidental. It destroyed the ship. It killed 270 sailors while it was in Havana Harbor. And of course, the rumors were rampant that the Cubans did it, the native Cubans did it to draw us into the war. And the other rumor was that the Spanish had done it to get us out of there. But it didn't matter who did it or whether it was an accident or on purpose. We in America are outraged. We had lost American citizens on foreign soil. So when Spain rejected America's demands for stopping all this and granting Cuba independence, Congress approved President McKinley's request for a declaration of war, which was justified as a humanitarian intervention, and adopted something called the Teller Amendment, declaring that the United States had no intention of annexing or dominating Cuba. I'm sorry, there's a group of young girls playing outside my living room window, and my dog's going nuts. The war was very brief and resulted in only a few hundred American casualties, and most of them were because of heat exhaustion. And it was called a splendid little war. And it was covered in the newspaper daily. Here we got, remember the Maine, remember the Maine. The war's most important battle actually occurred in the Pacific Ocean in Manila Bay in the Philippines, a Spanish colony where Admiral George Dewey defeated a Spanish fleet because they didn't know they were at war. So when the American Navy sent shots over the island, they thought they were shots of salute, and well, anyway, it was a joke. Without a fight, we took them. We didn't lose any Americans. The most publicized land battle was the war involved the assault on San Juan Hill outside Santiago, Cuba, made by Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. But now, Roosevelt was a pro-expansionist and believed war would unite the nation and its men. And he believed that our masculinity had suffered in the economic crisis in the 1890s. And although he organized the Rough Riders to be a cross-section of Americans, it excluded blacks. And he neglected to mention the black troops that actually reached the top of San Juan Hill before his troops did. But Roosevelt's exploits made him a national hero, and after the elected New York governor, he became the vice president to McKinley in his second election in 1900. And when McKinley was assassinated, of course, Theodore Roosevelt became president, and we'll get more into Roosevelt very shortly. I've got a lot to give you on that. He had used his successes in the war to run for governor of New York. Charged the Rough Riders up the San Juan Hill. The result of the war? Well, the war to liberate Cuba soon became an imperial mission that culminated with the creation of a small overseas American empire. President McKinley would not return the Philippines to Spain or hand it over to the Filipinos who thought that they had fought for their independence. We could govern ourselves, but we didn't believe they could govern themselves. He reminded Americans of the duty to uplift and civilize the Filipinos and train them to rule themselves in a treaty before ending the war. So we acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And before McKinley recognized Cuba's independence, he forced the island's new government to approve something called the Platt Amendment. I think I've got that here. No, I didn't have to mention that. Okay. Platt Amendment, and it's an addendum to the Cuban Constitution, which gives us the right to intervene in Cuba if we think it's necessary. Cuban patriots were extremely disappointed by what they saw as our betrayal, and resentment would inspire the revolution in Cuba 50 years later. But Americans' interest in their new possessions had more to do with trade than settlement or extracting resources. However, they sought Cuba and Puerto Rico and in the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. They thought those as outposts for trade and for refueling stations. Secretary of John Jay declared the open door policy, demanding that European powers, which had divided China into commercial spheres of influence, allow equal access to us. We were terribly afraid that if we allowed these people to come in, all these untrained foreigners, they're going to decrease wages. They're going to take over jobs by qualified Americans, and the unions didn't want this. So are we going to trade with them? Are we going to control them militarily? Are we going to give control back to them? And we're starting to have debates, especially over the Philippines. Okay, I told you about this, the Platt Amendment. That was, I thought, one of the cutest things that we could have come up with, a little backdoor thing. We needed the islands for outposts. We needed the islands for trade. We needed the islands for refueling stations. Okay, we're demanding the open door policy in China. And they're saying no. And all of a sudden, there's something going on over there called the Boxer Rebellion. The Chinese people are rebelling against the Russians and the Germans and the Americans aren't there, but everybody that's there in their own legation. And they wanted them gone. Well, I don't have a map handy, but if you think about where China is and where France and Germany and the rest of them are, I mean, they've got to either go on a boat all the way around South Africa, all the way around to China, or they have to go overland through Russia to get troops to where the people are. But we have troops in the Philippines. So when they asked us to help, we said, okay, but you got to open up the doors to China and let us come in. Well, we did put down the Boxer Rebellion rather quickly. Now, the Philippine War, which you've never even heard about. The Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans, they'd welcomed American intervention as a means to get independence from Spain. But continued American control, direct and indirect, it began to alienate some patriots. And after victory in the Philippines, Emmanuel Aguinaldo, the leader of the independent movement there, began to establish a provisional government with a constitution modeled on that of the American. But when McKinley decided to retain possession of the islands, he led a rebellion. It was a longer and more bloody war. It lasted from 1899 to 1903, costing the lives of more than 100,000 Filipinos and over 4,000 Americans. Oh, it was bad. It's something we didn't learn the lessons from. It was kind of a precursor of what was going to happen in Vietnam. We had never fought wars like this in jungles where you died of heat and where they dug pits and put stakes in there smeared with human excretion, and torture and waterboarding, and all these things were going on. And there were reports of atrocities against the Filipino civilians by us. We burned villages, we tortured, we raped, and there seemed to be some executions. And this just wasn't doing our image any good. Our image as a liberator. But we justified this war as an effort to uplift and civilize and Christianize. Now, the Filipino residents, most of them were already Catholic. That's Christian. But it didn't take long. We vastly outnumbered them, had better odds, better arms, and we did put down the revolution. We sent over William Howard Taft as a colonial governor. He told him to modernize the islands, build railroads and schools and public health, teach them modern agriculture, teach them how to vote, become good citizens. But of course, the politics in these new possessions, whether they were Philippines or anywhere else, tended to favor the land-based local elites. So whether you were native born or American, and usually created persistent poverty for the majority, it doesn't matter where you were, you're going to be poor. But this war, I wish we had more time to spend on it, but with these accelerated semesters, it's a war that, as I said, we did not learn our lessons. If we had, maybe it would have been done a little bit better and things differently in Vietnam. Some of the 1,200 Filipinos exhibited their poor. Poor as church mice, as the saying goes. But American rule, well, it came with the American racial attitudes too. An 1899 poem written by British writer Rudyard Kipling asked the United States to take up the white man's burden of imperialism, and American supporters of the empire felt that white domination of non-white peoples represented the progress of civilization. But America's new empire sparked an intense debate about the relationship between democracy, race, and American citizenship. Now, America's governmental system, our Constitution, had no provision for permanent colonies, and the right of every people to self-government was a key principle of our Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's idea of America as an empire of liberty assumed that new territories would eventually be admitted as new states, and its residents could become American citizens. As I said, McKinley was sent to Philippines. Now, are we going to let all these people be citizens? Are they going to become our subjects? Or just, what's the deal? It's William Howard Taft. He's going to later become a president. Yes, he's the one that had to have a special bathtub belt. After the Spanish-American War, nationalism, democracy, and American freedom, they seem to align with the ideas of Anglo-Saxon supremacy, which means white, Protestant, male. Both Democratic and Republican leaders wanted to retain the possessions, but they feared the negative consequences of incorporating any alien races into our country. Something called the Faulkner Act of 1900 declared Puerto Rico an insular territory, different from previous territories in the American West, because its 1 million inhabitants were defined as citizens of Puerto Rico, not citizens of the U.S., and they were denied a future path to statehood. The Filipinos were given the same status, and a series of cases decided between 1901 and 1904, known as the Insular Cases. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not fully apply to overseas territories held by the United States, thus limiting the extent of American freedom. So Congress tried to recognize the fundamental rights of these new people, but could otherwise govern them as it saw fit for an indefinite period of time. Hawaii became a traditional territory and was admitted as a state in 1959. The Philippines became independent in 1946, and although Congress gave American citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, Puerto Rico had the status of a commonwealth, neither a state or a territory, and it has its own government but lacks a voice in Congress and presidential elections. America's racial attitude had a global impact in the age of imperialism. Global concerns about immigration, race relations, and the white man's burden seemed to inspire solidarity among Anglo-Saxon nations. And Chinese exclusion and segregation in the Jim Crow South influenced discriminatory laws in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Other nations seemed to learn from Reconstruction's failure that multiracial democracy was impossible. America's new empire caused intense debate and controversy over what was going on, and opponents formed the Anti-Imperialism League, which united writers and social reformers who wanted reforms at home, businessmen who thought overseas empires were too expensive, and races who did not want any non-whites brought into the United States. The League warned Americans that empires was incompatible with democracy and urged Americans to help Puerto Ricans and Filipinos gain their independence. And of course, we thought our most important question at the time was, were we going to be a republic or an empire? Proponents of the American empire embraced the language of freedom too, and Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana argued that America sought abroad not market resources or nationalism power, but desired only to bring freedom to other people. Yeah, sure. That's what you call talking out of both sides of your mouth. America practiced a benevolent imperialism that would uplift backward cultures and spread liberty. Yeah. He also argued that we only went abroad for trade, not to rule other nations. And McKinley benefited from an economic recovery and a swell of patriotism from winning the war. Oh, it was great. We won the war, great. He beat Bryan again in 1900. And this is when Theodore Roosevelt became his vice president. There you go. McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. Writers at home and abroad in the 20th century predicted that American influence would soon pervade the globe. And in his book, The New Empire, Brooks Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, predicted that America's economic might would make it outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. Of course, this didn't happen until after World War II, but the characteristic that would constitute American global strength was already in place in 1900. We had already suppressed Britain, France, and Germany in our industrial production. The merger movement in 1897-1904 left much of the economy controlled by corporations. Politics had stabilized, and the white North and South had reconciled, well hardened along racial lines. Segregation, Chinese exclusion, Indian reservations limited the boundaries of citizenship and freedom. Yet questions central to 19th century debates over freedom, such as the relationship between economic and political liberty, the role of government in creating the social conditions for freedom, and the definition of citizenship and national identity, had not been finally answered. It's going to continue to be central to our American life into the 20th and 21st century. Now for Mr. Green to eliminate and amuse you again on the subject of imperialism.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about a subject near and dear to my white male heart, imperialism. So here at Crash Course, we occasionally try to point out that the U.S., much as we hate to admit it, is actually part of a larger world. Mr. Green, you mean like Alaska? No, me from the past. For reasons that you will understand after your trip there before your senior year of college, I do not acknowledge the existence of Canada's tail. No, I'm referring to all of the green parts of not America, and the period in the 19th century when we thought maybe we could make all those green parts like America, but, you know, without rights and stuff. So the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of expansion and colonization in Asia and Africa, mostly by European powers. As you'll know if you watched Crash Course World History, imperialism has a long history pretty much everywhere. So this round of empire building is sometimes called, rather confusingly, new imperialism. Because the U.S. acquired territory beyond its continental boundaries in this period, it's relatively easy to fit American history into this world history paradigm. But there's also an argument that the United States has always been an empire. From very early on, the European settlers who became Americans were intent on pushing westward and conquering territory. The obvious victims of this expansion/imperialism were the Native Americans, but we can also include the Mexicans who lost their sovereignty after 1848. And if that doesn't sound like an empire to you, allow me to draw your attention to the Russian Empire. Russians were taking control of territory in Central Asia and Siberia and either absorbing or displacing the native people who lived there, which was the exact same thing that we were doing. The empires of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were different because they were colonial in their own special way. Like Europeans and Americans would rule other places, but they wouldn't settle them and more or less completely displace the native people there. Well, except for you, Australia and New Zealand. American historians used to try to excuse America's acquisitions of a territorial empire as something of an embarrassing mistake, but that's misleading because one of the primary causes of the phenomenon of American imperialism was economics. We needed places to sell our amazing new products. And at the time, China actually had all of the customers because apparently it was opposite day. It's also not an accident that the U.S. began pursuing imperialism in earnest during the 1890s, as this was in many ways a decade of crisis in America. The influx of immigrants in the crowded cities added to anxiety and concern over America's future, and then, to cap it all off, in 1893, a panic caused by the failure of a British bank led the U.S. into a horrible economic depression. A Great Depression, but not the Great Depression. It did, however, feature 15,000 business failures and 17% unemployment. So take that, 2008. According to American diplomatic historian George Herring, imperialism was just what the doctor ordered to help America get out of its depression. Other historians, notably Kristen Hoganson, imply that America embarked on imperial adventures partly so that American men could prove to themselves how manly they were, you know, by joining the Navy and setting sail for distant waters. In 1890, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History and argued that to be a great power, like Great Britain, the U.S. needed needed to control the seas and dominate international commerce. Tied into this push to become a maritime power was the obsession with building a canal through Central America, and eventually the U.S. decided that it should be built in Panama because, you know, how else are we going to get malaria? In order to protect this canal, we would need a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. Sorry, I just wanted to get the palindrome in there somewhere. No, we would actually need much more than a man and a plan. We would need ships, and in order to have a functioning two-ocean navy, we would need colonies. Why? Because the steamships at the time were powered by coal, and in order to refuel, they needed coal depots. I mean, I suppose we could have, like, rented harbor space, but why rent when you can conquer? Also, nationalism and the accompanying pride in one's country was a worldwide phenomenon to which the U.S. was not immune. I mean, it's no accident that the 1890s saw Americans begin to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and celebrate Flag Day. And what better way to instill national pride than by flying the stars and stripes over Guam? So pre-Civil War attempts to expand beyond what we now know as the continental United States included our efforts to annex Canada, which were sadly unsuccessful, and also filibustering, which before it meant a senator talking until he or she had to stop to pee, was a thing where we tried to take over Central America to spread slavery. But the idea of taking Cuba persisted into the late 19th century because it is close and also beautiful. The Grant administration wanted to annex it and the Dominican Republic, but Congress demurred. But we did succeed in purchasing Canada's tail. You can see how I feel about that. To be fair, discovery of gold in the Yukon made Seward's icebox seem like less of a Seward's folly, and it did provide coaling stations in the Pacific. But we could have had rum and Caribbean beaches. Oh, Stan, all this talk about how much I hate Alaska has me overheated. I gotta take off my shirt. Oh, my life. So hard to take off a shirt dramatically. I'm angry. Anyway, coal stations in the Pacific were important because in 1854 we opened Japan to American trade by sending a flotilla of threatening black ships under Matthew Perry. No, Stan, not that Matthew Perry. You know better. By far America's best piece of imperial business before 1898 was Hawaii. Like, I like oil and gold as much as the next guy, but Hawaii has pineapples and also sugar, which were grown on American-owned plantations by Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and native workers. Treaties between the U.S. and Hawaiian governments exempted this sugar from tariffs, and America also had established a naval base at Pearl Harbor, which seemed like a really good idea then. We eventually annexed Hawaii in 1898, and this meant that it could eventually become a state, which it did in 1959, 2 years before Barack Obama was born in Kenya. And this leads us nicely to the high tide of American imperialism, the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War. The war started out because native Cubans were revolting against Spain, which was holding on to Cuba for dear life as the remnant of a once great empire. The Cubans' fight for independence was brutal. 95,000 Cubans died from disease and malnutrition after Spanish General Valeriano Weiler herded Cubans into concentration camps. For this, Weiler was called Butcher in the American Yellow Press, which sold a lot of newspapers on the backs of stories about his atrocities. And at last we come to President William McKinley, who responded cautiously with a demand that Spain get out of Cuba or face war. Now, Spain knew that it couldn't win a war with the U.S., but as George Herring put it, they preferred the honor of war to the ignominy of surrender. Let that be a lesson to you. Always choose ignominy. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either right or I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got today. With such a conflict waged for years in an island so near us and with which our people have such trade and business relations, when the lives and liberty of our own citizens are in constant danger and their property destroyed and themselves ruined, where our trading vessels are liable to seizure and are seized at our very doorstep by warships of a foreign nation, the expeditions of filibustering that we are powerless to prevent altogether, all these and others that I need not mention, with the resulting strained relations, are a constant menace to our peace, and compel us to keep on a semi-war footing with a nation with which we are at peace. Thank you, Stan. This is obviously President William McKinley's war message to Congress. You can tell it's a war message because it includes the word peace more than the word war. By the way, it's commonly thought that President McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war. He didn't. He let Congress take the lead. That's the only time that's ever happened in all of American history, which would be more impressive if we had declared war more than 5 times. So the document shows us that, at least according to McKinley, we officially went to war for American peace of mind and to end economic uncertainty. It was not to gain territory, at least not in Cuba. How do we know? Because Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, which forswore any U.S. annexation of Cuba, perhaps because representatives of the U.S. sugar industry, like Colorado Senator Henry Teller, feared competition from sugar produced in an American Cuba, Or maybe not, but probably so. Also not the cause of the war was the sinking of the USS Maine. The battleship, which had been in Havana's harbor to protect American interests, sank after an explosion on February 15, 1898, killing 266 sailors. Now, most historians chalk up the sinking to an internal explosion and not to Spanish sabotage, but that didn't stop Americans from blaming the Spanish with their memorable meme, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual war was one of the most successful in U.S. history, especially if you measure success by brevity and relative paucity of deaths. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war, and in many ways it was. Fighting lasted about 4 months, and fewer than 400 Americans were killed in combat, although 5,000 died of, wait for it, disease. Stupid disease, always ruining everything. There weren't a ton of battles, but those that happened got an inordinate amount of press coverage, like the July attack on San Juan Hill at the Cuban city of Santiago, led by future President Theodore Roosevelt. While it was a successful battle, the real significance is that it furthered Roosevelt's career. He returned a hero, promptly became governor of New York, and by 1900 was McKinley's vice president, which was a good job to have because McKinley would eventually be assassinated. A more important battle was that of Manila Bay, in which Commodore George Dewey destroyed a tiny Spanish fleet and took the Philippines. This battle took place in May of 1898, well before the attack on Cuba, which strongly suggests that a war that was supposedly about supporting Cuban independence was really about something else. And what was that something else? Oh, right, a territorial empire. As a result of the war, the U.S. got a bunch of new territories, notably the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We also used the war as an opportunity to annex Hawaii to protect our ships that would be steaming toward the Philippines. We didn't annex Cuba, but we didn't let it become completely independent either. The Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution authorized American military intervention whenever it saw fit and gave us a permanent lease for a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Cuba and Puerto Rico were gateways to Latin American markets. Puerto Rico was particularly useful as a naval station. Hawaii, Guam, and especially the Philippines opened up access to China. American presence in China was bolstered by our contribution of about 3,000 troops to the multinational force that helped put down the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. But in the Philippines, where Americans had initially been welcome, opinions soon changed after it became clear that Americans were there to stay and exercise control. Emiliano Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipino rebellion against Spain, quickly turned against the U.S. because his real goal was independence, and it appeared the U.S. would not provide it. The resulting Philippine War lasted 4 years, from 1899 to 1903, and 4,200 Americans were killed, as well as over 100,000 Filipinos. The Americans committed atrocities, including putting Filipinos in concentration camps, torturing prisoners, rape, and executing civilians. And much of this was racially motivated, and news of these atrocities helped to spur anti-imperialist sentiment at home, with Mark Twain being one of the most outspoken critics. Now, there was some investment in modernization in the Philippines, in railroads, schools, and public health, but the interests of the local people were usually subordinated to those of the wealthy. So American imperialism, in short, looked like most other imperialisms. So Constitution nerds will remember that the U.S. Constitution has no provision for colonies, only territory that will eventually be incorporated as states. Congress attempted to deal with this issue by passing the Foraker Act in 1900. This law declared that Puerto Rico would be an insular territory. Its inhabitants would be citizens of Puerto Rico, not the United States, and there would be no path to statehood. But this wasn't terribly constitutional. Congress did extend U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917. Now it's a commonwealth with its own government that has no voice in the U.S. Congress or presidential elections and no control over its own defense or environmental policy. The Philippines were treated similarly to Puerto Rico in a series of cases between 1901 and 1904, collectively called the Insular Cases. But Hawaii was treated differently because it had a sizable population of American settlers who happened to be white. Ergo, it became a traditional territory with a path to statehood because white people, and also pineapples. Now let's briefly talk about anti-imperialism. There were lots of people who objected to imperialism on racial grounds, arguing that it might lead to, like, diversity. But there were also non-racist anti-imperialists who argued that empire itself, with its political domination of conquered people, was incompatible with democracy, which, to be fair, it is. The Democratic Party, which had supported intervention in Cuba in 1900, opposed the Philippine War in its platform. Some progressives opposed imperialism too, because they believed that America should focus on its domestic problems. Yet those who supported imperialism were just as forceful. Among the most vocal was Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge, who argued that imperialism was benevolent and would bring a new day of freedom. But make no mistake, underneath it all, imperialism was all about trade. According to Beveridge, America's commerce must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. In the end, imperialism was really driven by economic necessity. necessity. In 1902, Brooks Adams predicted in his book, The New Empire, that the U.S. would soon, quote, outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. Within 20 years, America would be the world's leading economic power. We didn't have the most overseas territory, but ultimately, that didn't matter. Now, the reasons for imperialism, above all the quest for markets for American goods, would persist long after imperialism became recognized as antithetical to freedom and democracy. And we would continue to struggle to reconcile our imperialistic urges with our ideals about democracy until now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, Rosiana Rojas, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Every week there's a new caption for the Libertage. You can...
Well, Mr. Green is, as always, interesting. I will have the word list for you, and of course you've already got the study outline of the chapter. There was a lot going on in that short decade. Enjoy, thank you for listening, and don't forget to do your quiz.